The French call the first general policy speech of a prime minister before parliament the great oral exam. That expression taking a whole new layer of meaning when the PM is 34 years young. We'll ask how Gabriel Attal, youngest head of government in 2 centuries, weathered the traditional jeers and whistles from the opposition benches in a National Assembly where the ruling centrists do not have a majority. And with farmers' tractors converging on the capital, how's he handling his first nationwide protest movement? The same protest by agriculture workers that have mushroomed across Europe, forcing Attal into hard bargaining with unions and industry reps ahead of an EU summit Thursday, where France will talk up ideas like sovereignty and a French agricultural exception. Speaking of sovereignty, Attal talking up curbs on immigration, better pay for those who work than those who don't. Effective enough, his rhetoric in that speech, to siphon votes from a surging far right? Today in the France 24 debate, Gabriel Attal's baptism of fire. With us, George Kuzmanovic, leader of the République Souveraine Party. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Columnist and political strategist Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet is with us as well. How are you?
Hello, Francois.
Shaheen Valley, senior fellow at the DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And Charlotte Mainvielle, co-chair of the UK branch of France's Green Party. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, the first general policy speech of a prime minister before parliament, one of those time-honored traditions that it doesn't move the dial much, but it does set a tone. It can't make a mandate. It can break it if the speech is bad. Attal talking up secularism, paying tribute to the armed forces, calling for more cops, and what he called a civic rearmament to battle juvenile delinquency. Also making the middle classes his priority.
There is and must be a French agricultural exception. I'm clear-minded about the piling up of norms and about decisions that come from above and sometimes come from who knows where.
Yeah, the new prime minister talking about a cultural, like there's a cultural exception in France to protect and subsidize film and publishing, talking about an agricultural exception. And that was really at the heart of the speech. And that's the heart of, you could say, this sovereignist tone that we heard. George Kuzmanovic, your thoughts about the expression, a French agricultural exception?
Well, I should be happy. That's what we want, but that's not what they're doing. And it was a big show, a fine show. He knows how to speak. He was a speaker for a former government of Mr. Macron, but
he was the government spokesperson.
Yeah, the government spokesperson for Mr. Castex, who was prime minister. But the funny thing is that it's like Macron's speech 2 weeks ago. It's like they just won a general election and they're proposing a new policy for the country, which is funny because they're on top of the power since 10 years, both. And so it's very bizarre, and especially for French agriculture. They're doing everything not to have a specific French agriculture. In the same time, he's giving this speech in Brussels. They're signing a new treaty with Chile of free trade.
We'll talk more about that because
it's funny. It's at the same time. It's opening more our market to production that is made with the lower social and lower environmental constraints than for the French agriculture.
We're going to be checking in later with our Brussels correspondent because most notably we heard the French president today basically kill a trade deal with South America which is where agriculture was at the heart of it. Before we dive into the crisis at hand for the government, which is the farmers, and again on Monday night he had 3 hours of closed-door discussions. There's more negotiations set to happen between now and Thursday's EU summit. First off, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, the tone of the new prime minister.
He's energetic. He's quite professional about it. He's not. He's a serious guy. He appears to be serious, but on the negative side, he's very, very young. He sounds young, and he doesn't have any political strengths. He doesn't have any MPs on his side, doesn't have any past experience. So it's a spokesperson being nominated at the rank of prime minister. It's a spokesperson that became a prime minister, but he's not a prime minister yet. It will take some time, I think. But he's not bad at it. As a spokesperson, he was good, he's still good. As a prime minister, he's not there yet. Although he speaks a lot about himself, there were 3 parts in this speech. The first part was about crisis management, try to calm down the farmers, try to, avoid a blockage of Paris and of food supplies, and they tried to not have the Yellow Vest movement all over again. That's the number 1 priority. The second part of the speech was made in order to win the next European elections. So we have to seduce the older voters that are the core of Macron's electorate, and that's very much the follow-up of the presidential press conference. That's basically the same thing.
He talked about things like civic rearmament.
Yeah, that was the motto of.
What does that mean?
It means that the old people don't really remember that they were young ones, and they want the youth to be disciplined. As when we get older, François, we want the youngest to be more in line. That's a strange thing. He's talking to the older part.
Do as we say, not as we do. Okay.
And the third part was about himself. He said "I" 144 times, which is kind of the double or triple than is compared to his predecessors. So he says "I" a lot, "I," because he needs to exist. He needs to assert himself.
So Chahine Valley, he said some right-wing stuff, but he also said how convinced he was of being a European and what a mistake Brexit was. And this is where he got some of his biggest applause, talking up the fact that he is France's first openly homosexual prime minister. So a lot happened in that more than 1 hour that he spoke.
No, you're right. He tried to paint a very pro-European policy, in the footsteps of Macron's European ambition. But that rubs against what he described when he talked about the agricultural policy, pretending that the agricultural policy was entirely driven and made up in Brussels, as though France had not entirely shaped Europe's common agricultural policy, and as though France was not the first beneficiary of that European agricultural policy. So there's a number of contradictions in this speech between a stance that wants to be very pro-European and at the same time a form of criticism around Europe's agricultural policy that France has been designing and benefiting from.
Gesundheit. He comes from he defected from the Socialist Party to join Emmanuel Macron when he first launched his campaign back in 2016. But it was interesting to see how there were shades in his speech of Nicolas Sarkozy. Sarkozy, who when he was running for president, went for a pre-dawn campaign stop in 2007 to Europe's largest wholesale market, Rungis. This is near Orly Airport, south of Paris. There he talked up one of his big campaign themes at the time, the France that wakes up early. And you had the sense, listening to Gabriel Attal, that there was the tribute for those who work hard.
Yes, I mean, this is a line that's been, the hallmark of the French right, and this government has clearly moved to the right. I mean, compared to 2017, when Macron tried to be in the middle of the road between the left and the right, there's been clearly a lurch to the right, which has been both visible in the policies undertaken by Macron and his successive governments, and the choice of personnel. It's ironic that Gabriel Attal, who indeed, as you rightly pointed out, comes from the Socialist Party in the first place, is now probably the most right-wing prime minister that Macron has had. But that reflects the fact that in order to command a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, the government needs to move to the right. and in fact to adopt in a number of cases, in particular on immigration, for instance, ideas and policies that not only belong to the right, but in fact belong to the far right.
Charles Maviel, is that just a reflection of public opinion in France?
Well, I mean, I think he's might be born in 1989, like he said. He's definitely not ahead of his time, and we've definitely had some flashbacks of Sarkozy's policies, as you rightly mentioned. And I think you can also see how he's treating young people. You know, he's talking about putting in place a state national service for young people. He's talking about how he wants to, for example, impose uniforms, which they're trialing and they might expand. It's a very backward way of seeing our society. And there's also a lot of conservative discourse around sovereignty, around the nation. And he's very much using the language that President Macron used in his recent speech, talking about civic rearmament, like you mentioned. And you can see that he's very much declaring a war actually on poor people. He says he wants to stock inactivity, for example, for unemployed people. He's been very dismissive of environmental norms, for example. So it seems like it's a very conservative stance. And I think there's very little to hope for and to expect from the months to come with what he's telling us here.
George Kuzmanovic, is this a shift in policy, or is this or is this the same that this government has had, well, ever since 2022?
I think it will be the same. It's just here. It's just a show, and they have to do something because you have a big unrest among farmers, and it's not so good among people working in the public hospitals. Teachers are not happy with the new minister they have. The situation is complicated, so he has to make a good speech, but that's it.
And perhaps undermining Gabriel Attal a little bit is his boss going abroad on a 2-day state visit to Sweden, the French president, in the role the 1958 Constitution imagined of a head of state who stays above the fray. But then he delves into the farmers' protests and at a press conference spells out his red lines, the ones he'll be taking to the president of the European Commission when that EU summit takes place on Thursday.
First, to have clear rules set up around imports from Ukraine, because we have today, in terms of volume and quality, something that's destabilizing the European market, be it poultry or cereals. Second, we want more clarity on the negotiations with Mercosur. We ask that the deal that's currently on the table not be signed. And third, to have some flexibility, without getting too technical, with regards to fallow lands.
And for more, let's go to Brussels and correspondent Dave Keating. Dave, is all those three demands there, is that just going to be taken in stride, or is he throwing down the gauntlet to the rest of the EU there?
I'm not sure how seriously he means this, because I was told by an EU official today that there has been no request to put agriculture formally on the agenda on Thursday. What will happen is that President Macron will have a side conversation with Commission President von der Leyen about those issues he mentioned. But he would have been able to bring them up at a dinner that's taking place between EU leaders tomorrow night here in Brussels. But as I understand it, he's not attending that dinner. He's going to still be in Sweden. That would be the place to bring this up if he was really serious about this. And backing out of Mercosur would be a pretty big move. So I think today in Brussels, people are not really sure what to make of this. They're also really not sure what to make of this talk from Prime Minister Attal about the agricultural exception, in the same way that there's the cultural exception. That's going to leave a lot of people outside France scratching their heads, because, as was just mentioned before, a lot of people outside France see the Common Agricultural Policy, or PAC as it's known in France, as being a tailor-made vehicle for French protectionism. It's 1/3 of the EU budget. It is not a popular policy outside of France, and many people see it as a French policy made by French people for French people, for French farmers. So to be asking for an exception to that policy, which benefits France more than it benefits any other country, I think if Macron comes to Brussels asking for that, he is not going to get a very enthusiastic response. As I say, the PAC might be popular in France, but it is not popular in the rest of the EU.
Yeah, and it's, Dave, just to, if he brings up, how much of a can of worms does he open when he starts talking about agriculture? Because a lot of what we're hearing from the French farmers is complaints about, yes, being undermined by foreign competition, but sometimes that foreign competition is inside of the European Union. We had one farmer talking about Spanish cherries the other day.
Yeah, it's an open market. I mean, that's the design of the single market. The products should be able to compete with each other fairly. And if you start talking about exceptions and protectionism, that is against the principles of the EU single market. Also, there was an opportunity to do these things in 2021. The CAP goes on 6-year cycles. The next time to talk about revising the CAP isn't until 2027. So it's really not a time period where you could actually renegotiate a lot of these things. It should also be noted that the very, very few green elements that were added to the CAP in 2021, most of those provisions, or a significant number of those provisions, have been delayed because of the effect of the Ukraine war. For instance, the set-aside that he's talking about, the effects of that haven't really been felt. I think it's worth noting here that we're seeing these farmer protests across Europe, in the Netherlands and Germany and Spain, but in Germany, the farmers aren't blaming the EU, and the politicians aren't pointing the finger at Brussels either. They're very much focused on that budget revision that's happening in Berlin at the moment. So there does seem to be a little traditional Brussels bashing going on here by the government, or at least an attempt to deflect some of the farmers' anger toward Brussels so that they don't receive the brunt of it themselves.
Cheyenne Valley, many thanks, Dave Keating, for that update from Brussels. Cheyenne Valley, your reaction, can we just say that beyond just even France, it's the end of free trade deals as we know them? I mean, this isn't a big surprise, is it, when you hear Emmanuel Macron saying, don't sign the free trade deal with South America, Mercosur?
This is not a big surprise in the sense that, this was the direction of travel for a while in Europe. It is a big surprise to hear it from Macron because he has been supporting the Mercosur agreement since he was elected in 2017. And he was actually considering those who were opposing these free trade agreements as being excessively conservative and worried about their consequences, both for the environment and for the agricultural sector. So it's not a surprise, but it's a big turnaround and a big policy change for Macron himself. And I would second what was said about the common agricultural policy. Not only does the policy is mostly French in design and benefiting mostly French farmers, but also I would stress the fact that there is inbuilt flexibility inside the common agricultural policy that gives quite a lot of leeway to each individual member states to allocate the subsidies in the way it wants. And these flexibilities are not used by the French government. So the French government could decide, for instance, to cap the amount of support to large agribusiness farms and favor smaller farmers, and it decides not to do that. The French government could decide to allocate specifically to young farms to create new farms, and it specifically doesn't do that. So there are lots of flexibilities that are allowed that the French government has decided not to use, in part because it benefits the largest farms that are backed by and represented by the dominant agricultural union, the FNSEA. So I think, this deflection towards Brussels is not only problematic because France has been so critical in designing the common agricultural policy, but it's also evading the domestic national responsibilities for creating a more environmentally friendly agricultural policy.
George Kuzmanovic, this is something perhaps that's not framed enough in conversations here in France. the common agricultural policy does work for French farmers, big French farmers, not the little ones. And the big industry group there that you heard Shaheen name call there, the call out there, the FNSCA, they're not working for the interests of the little guy, are they?
Exactly. I completely agree with Mr. Shaheen Vali. What he said is very true, completely true.
So what do you do?
Now,
What do you do to help the small?
80% of the European money that's going to support farmers is taken by less than 20% of.
So how do you help the
farmers.
small family farm?
So, well, we have a lot of ideas, but what Mr. Macron is doing is just talks, like Mr. Attal. He talks to calm the poor farmers that are not receiving so much help, and because of the decisions of the French government, as Mr. Shaheen Vali said. So, and I do not see what they will do, because at the same time, once again, Macron is with Olaf Scholz. He wants to cancel the veto right of governments. This will be the talk of the European Council the 1st of February. They want to do it because they want to give support to Ukraine and Mr.
Yeah, that's the main item on the agenda, which is helping Ukraine.
It's the same. If they remove the veto, they will have no veto for against Mercosur. And as Mr. Shaheen
Well, they can't
said,
remove the veto right. The treaties don't allow that.
Yeah.
But they can go around Hungary, is what they can do.
Mr. Macron doesn't want that. He wanted the Mercosur.
Charlotte Mainviel, what do you do to help the small French farmer, and what would you have liked to have heard Gabriel Attal announce?
Yes, well, I think there's a lot to do to support the small French farmers. You know, we need to value their wages better. We need to reduce the margins of big supermarkets. You know, and we also need to revise some of these trade deals that are not protective of French small farmers. It makes no sense, for example, for us to look at importing lamb from New Zealand, for example. So, you know, there's this device that's trying to be made in terms of the, environmentalists versus the farmers, but actually we're hand in hand wanting to defend a new model. The FNSEA, which was mentioned earlier, which is the dominant union, actually, is very much, like you've said, defending the few, but not the many, and not the smaller farmers there. If you look, for example, at one mobilization that we've done jointly with other unions, like the Confédération Paysanne, for example, last year in Sainte-Soline against like a mega water reservoir, that was only benefiting 6% of agricultures, of farmers. So there needs to be a better use and a better use of our natural resources, which are really scarce. We also need to look collectively at getting out of some pesticides, because we know that actually that's detrimental to farmers, it's toxic to farmers, but also to consumers. And we need to support farmers to be able to transition on that journey. And we, of course, need to look at revaluing their wages. And there's also a big role that the state can play, because let's remember that the state is actually a big consumer and buyer of agricultural products. So if you look at, for example, in certain cities, in green cities, where we've looked at buying for schools, for example, looking at buying locally, buying organic. So there's things that we need to do to support farmers to transition, revalue their wages, and also tackle these big agro-industries, which are the ones that are making most money and which are detrimental to smaller and more green way of farming.
So Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, on the French all news channels, particularly the more right-leaning ones, they've been saying, basically, these green policies are punishing the little guy. And things like, as you just heard from Charlotte, getting rid of the pesticides. Is the conversation in France being framed as the farmers versus the environmentalists?
Each debate we have is framed from a conservative perspective nowadays. That's how it always ends. We always start with, social concrete problems that could be solved both ways, left, right. We could find solutions at both ends of the spectrum. But the current mood is that it always ends up in a conservative worldview, always seen through conservative spectacles. So we are fighting against environmental regulations. But it's been said, and we need to say it, the Ecologist Party and all the people in favor of the environment, they all are on the side of the farmers. They are not against the farmers. I mean, we all have ultimately the same goal and the same problem. The main point has been made. There is a divide between the small farmers and the big farmers. And the big farmers are fighting for their own interest, not for the interest of the small farmers.
We're having that conversation here, but that's not the conversation I'm hearing in
the country. The conversation is
in a lot of other places.
What the small farmers say is that I don't have enough money to live from what I do.
Right.
That's the main concern they have. There is too much. There are too much difficulties for us to make a living out of what we should be doing.
Yeah.
That's the main
and
concern.
their margins have been squeezed.
And the way
since
we
COVID.
are framing it collectively is, why? We should have less environmental regulations. But that's indeed not a solution. That's only an electoral solution because there are elections to come in next June. If we were more quiet collectively, we could address it differently.
Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far right, cheering on the protest movement last Thursday.
Sure.
She visited a farm in her home constituency in the Rust Belt portion of northern France.
If agriculture in France goes under, our entire country goes under, because our country is a great agricultural power. And if it stops being one, then it is also our sovereignty and our food security which will start to bleed. We must therefore implement a major rescue plan.
And there's that word again, sovereignty, and Marine Le Pen using it. You just heard Charlotte Mainvielle saying this shouldn't be the environmentalists versus the farmers, and yet when you when you watch the latest polls, the far right's going up and the environmentalists are going down.
Yeah, but I agree with Mr. completely. The problem is that the farmers are not paid for their work. That's it. Point. And the margin are all most of the margins are taken and the benefits are taken by the agribusiness. That's it. And you have to know that the leader of the main union, FNSEA, is also the big boss of a big multinational agribusiness company called April.
So environmental regulations, what do you do when it comes to environmental regulations?
Well, you have to have protectionism policies. If you have products that are produced with in a way that is not environmental correct, then you cannot sell it in a country where your own farmers can't produce it. So it's completely crazy because you bring food that is cheaper and your guys are producing food that is not so cheap and they're not paid for it. It's crazy. That's why there is some insanity in if you look at the reality of what they're living and the real situation of produce that are bring from other countries, and once again we are just
but free trade agreements
after New Zealand.
But free trade agreements don't just have agriculture in them. It means that
Yes,
you can export
no.
your airplanes. It means you can export.
Yes, Germany can export their cars.
So can France.
It's open bar for food. I mean, it's. Look at what was signed with the free trade agreement with New Zealand and the one with, that is just signed right now with Chile. It's a huge amount of food that is coming on the French or European market without taxes. So it's more pain for the small farmers.
Cheyenne Valley, you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And I would add that, the solution we often hear that if we loosened our environmental standards, things would be easier for farmers, is really problematic. I come from a small island in the Caribbean that belongs to France, where there was a massive historical pesticide scandal called the chlordécone, where essentially the entire banana plantation were sprayed with a toxic pesticide, and now not only the whole soil is poisoned, we have the highest cancer rates in the country, and we have poisoned seawater that prevents us from fishing. this is the sort of problem we have when we loosen environmental norms and standards. So I don't think this is a solution. It's not a solution for the farmers who are the first to die from illness from these pesticides, and it's not a solution for the consumer. So I think we have to really, and especially given France's history and the history of these islands, we owe it to our farmers and to our consumers to be extremely careful with our environmental norms and standards, and not consider that loosening them would be a solution for anyone. What we should do, and which is something that Spain has done, is to guarantee to farmers that their products will not be sold at a loss and will not be sold below a minimum price. And I think we could fix a floor to prices, which would also, I think, lead to a different attitude and to a less productivist attitude, whereby what matters is not so much quantities, because in fact we have no problem about food security in Europe. We have excess production, in part because we are producing too much of the wrong stuff. And so I think guaranteeing minimum prices for farmers would, I think, help them to shift to a more responsible agriculture.
And we have to add to that the banana example is very good, because not only they have put all chlordecone on Martinique, Guadeloupe, and it's a catastrophe, but the banana business is destroyed completely. We are importing bananas from Central America because also there they use the bad environmental product, but the work is cheaper. So anyway, banana are cheaper here when they come from, I don't know, Costa Rica, or it's Dole before it was Chiquita. So they have taken poison in their blood, plus their banana industry is completely destroyed.
That's true. If we let big corporations frame the debate, we will have an environmental solution to an economical problem, and we won't have the right environmental solution for the very farmers themselves. And we are speaking about, having babies. There is a problem of fertility. That is linked to the current toxics that we have in the water, for instance. That has been that has been said, that has been studied. We are sure about it. So it's a bad thing to lessen the environmental regulations.
Yeah, but the argument that's been made...
calm down the guys, that will be back in 2 years.
The argument that's been made is, yes, but we're following the rules here in Europe, but they're not elsewhere.
Sure, we need protectionism. I'm in favor of it, that's for sure. We need to give protectionism. We need to have rules. If we want to have environmental standards, they need to be enforced. And every great power in place on the globe has protectionism in place. I mean, the US are not accepting anything on the pretense that it's free market. That's not true. That's a lie. Yeah. That's a lie.
One final question, because I know you have to leave us a little bit earlier.
Sorry about that.
A new poll last week for the European Council on Foreign Relations think tank points to a right-wing populist surge for those June European elections that you were referencing earlier. The Identity and Democracy voting bloc, that includes Marine Le Pen's National Rally, Germany's AfD, nearly doubling in size and becoming the next EU Parliament's third biggest force.
That's the main threat.
But what happens between now and June? What should the campaign be about?
It's what Gabriel Attal is trying to do, telling to the right-wing voters, don't vote for the populist. We are the solution.
What's the message that will resonate?
We will satisfy you on your moral demands. We have the same moral standards that you have, guys. We don't have the same solutions. We won't go to that extremes, and we are more pragmatic. We are more competent. We are more clever than these guys. So stick with us. Don't go there. They try not to lose too much. The National Front, the populists, should win this election, but they want to reduce the margin of the loss on the Macronist side.
Yeah, a little more than 30% last time around.
And maybe there will be a third guy. Raphael Glucksmann is raising fast. He's the only one able to capture...
The socialist-backed candidate.
To take part of the Macronist votes, take part of the pro-Macron votes. He can take part of them. The votes that are coming from the left could go with him, and he could take some of the ecologist votes, and maybe the socialist votes, and he could do something new. Maybe it could be the third guy, and maybe the second guy with a great campaign. It depends on what Gabriel Attal will be able to achieve. Gabriel Attal is there to block the Front National, the Rassemblement National, is there to block the populists.
Thanks so much for being with us, Philippe Molchevalet. Sorry you have to leave our conversation earlier.
Thank you.
Charlotte Mainviel, what's the recipe for widening your base if you're running in those European elections?
I mean, I think we definitely need to portray how environmental solutions are for the long term. We've talked just earlier now about pesticides. We've seen, for example, how Nestle, there's a recent investigation showing that they've been trying to filter water illegally to counter some contaminations that have been happening. We've heard earlier the example of the chlordécone in Martinique and Guadeloupe and how that pesticide has meant that they have some of the highest rates.
But sorry to interrupt, Charlotte. Are these going to be your bread and butter issues to try to broaden your base for those June elections? What's the issue?
Yeah. I think the issues are around environmental and social justice and how they really go hand in hand. And you know how Macron has been talking about demographic rearmament and the importance to have more children, etc. And we know how much that's linked to environmental, of course, in terms of impacting our fertility, but also bringing up children in a world that offers some hope. And if people aren't having children, there's also a reason around that because of, the lack of hope of bringing them in a world where, they're going to be able to breathe clean air, where they're going to be able to have access to social services. We've seen how our public health services, for example, are really impacted. Our educational services, I think investing in public services is something that a lot of people feel strongly about. And we're seeing how teachers are going to go on strike on Thursdays because France has one of the poorest remuneration rate for our teachers within the OECD. So I think investing in public services, offering social protections, and also in tackling the climate crisis, which is going to affect us all, is definitely going to be something that is going to be our priority for these upcoming European elections.
Cheyenne Valley, in France and more broadly in Europe, we heard a lot of things there from Charlotte. So which is it? Is it going to be about protection, public services? Is it going to be about protecting the borders? Is it going to be about sovereignty, as George has talked about here? What's going to be the defining issue of this European elections campaign, not just in France, but across the continent?
I think, sadly, a common thread and a common theme across Europe has been and remains the question of migration and Europe's identity. I don't think the European election should be fought on this topic, but I think there will be. And what I find concerning is that liberals, and I include this government under that label, even though I probably should not, don't have a clear articulated message about Europe's migration challenge and Europe's identity. As we have seen in France, Macron's government has essentially caved in to a number of ideas of the far right when it comes to migration, and has stopped presenting immigration as an absolute necessity, not only for France, but for Europe more broadly, and a necessity that requires a different set of policies to welcome people from other countries in Europe much better. It's very ironic.
Well, we heard the Prime Minister in his speech. We heard the Prime Minister in his speech talk about welcoming fewer migrants, but welcoming them better.
Well,
yes, but in fact, we need a lot more migrants. We don't need less of them, and we all need to welcome them better. I think the idea that we should treat well Canadians or Americans that come to build startups in Paris, and that we can afford to treat badly the cleaners and the housekeepers and those who work in kitchen, is an idea that's profoundly flawed, because we need more of lower skilled workers than we need startup-partners in the country. I mean, the professions that are in acute need of workers at the moment are those that are lesser skilled. And these are the people that we need to treat better. And these are the people that we are not treating well, and therefore that we are missing. So it's very ironic that we flag our demographic challenges, that we worry about our fertility rate, and that we don't see that immigration is an important part of the solution rather than a part of the problem.
George Kuzmanovic, you agree?
Yeah, in fact, it's strange because I think we agree on the diagnostic, but in the contrary of, for example, the Green Party, we don't think that this Europe can be changed from inside, because that's they want and that's how they go to the election. That's a fraud. This Europe, as it is built, and it's a Europe that is built for the big business, for the agribusiness, and the people, they don't have the voice in this Europe. It has to be it's not only that we want to go out of this Europe, we want to destroy it and rebuild another organization that will be more respect the each state nations and each people. And this is not done by this Europe. You can do nothing within with these European treaties. So the first thing is to gain back sovereignty, not only national, but the people's sovereignty, which means democracy.
Charlotte Mainvielle, you're sitting in London. They've left the European Union. Your thoughts?
Oh, well, we've seen how well that's gone, Brexit, right? I mean, it's been an absolute disaster. And I think, we definitely have to, the Green Party has a very much favorable approach to the European Union and working collectively to address some of our challenges. But I totally agree with what's been said earlier about migration. It's a strength to a lot of countries, particularly when we're looking at demographic issues. But also I think we need to adopt a more humane approach to this subject. There's talks about reforming medical aid for migrants, for example, and of course from a human rights perspective, it doesn't make sense and it's cruel. But also from a public health perspective, it makes no sense to try and restrict people's access to health. So I think, we really need to think about what are actually people's real priorities. There was a study during the presidential election that showed that migration was the second most talked about topic in the media during the French presidential election, when actually it was only the ninth subject of interest of French people. It was a study by a radio channel, France Culture, that showed that. And I think there's a disproportionate lens and focus, particularly from media
on the wrong issues. Charlotte Mainvielle, unfortunately, we're running short on time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank Shahin Valley in Brussels, George Kuzmanovic. I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.